Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking with Cameron Murray. A special guest today, James Nuzzo. Nuzzo for the Italians. He runs a really terrific Substack, the Nuzzo newsletter, about exercise science, gender, academia, all those things we like to nerd out on. And I wanted to have James here today because he he just looks at the data on gender, on academia, on science, and there's some uncomfortable truths there that I think are very detached from our public conversation. So let's dig into those and see what they are, see what's the result of them. So James, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Maybe you could introduce yourself to listeners. You've got a bit of a story about sort of being cancelled in academia. But before we get to the story, what are your research interests and sort of what are you known for in the research community?
Yeah, so I currently live in Perth, Western Australia, but I'm from the US, and I'm a dual citizen. My background is in exercise science, and that that history is more the kind of physiological effects of strength training on the body. So what happens within your body that makes your muscles stronger, for example, after we go through training programs. But over the years, my interest has started to shift a little bit toward more of sex differences, both in psychology and in physiology. And so that's why I now discuss a lot of men's health epidemiological data. And also, as you mentioned in your intro there, I do talk a lot about academia as sort of an enterprise and a lot of the issues that are popping up there. And a lot of those issues also relate to things about sex and gender.
Maybe we could get a little bit of your story about being cancelled in academia and your experience with that before we get into the data and the graphs. Is there a quick way to summarize it? You've got a very long article in your newsletter. What's your current situation and how did you get there via this cancellation?
Yeah, so the summarized version of this is I was affiliated with Edith Cowan University in Perth from about March of 2019 to March of 2025, so just earlier this year. And my positions there varied a little bit. So sometimes I was paid research staff, but other times when I went to work in industry, I was an adjunct lecturer there, which means not paid staff, but you are affiliated with the university, and and you do that to sort of collaborate with researchers there, those who I knew from working there previously. And then eventually I ended up back after industry, I worked there again. In March of 2025, what happened was that my adjunct position was up for renewal, and the School of Medical and Health Sciences decided not to renew it. The decision not to renew it was a bit strange because I'm a quite productive researcher and I had ongoing collaborations there. So it was kind of a weird decision, especially because adjunct positions don't really cost the university all that much. You're not a paid employee or anything, and the university gets the benefit of having their name on all your paper publications and so on. Um, in the years kind of leading up to that decision, various stories were told to me and things happened to me that made me think that this was a politically motivated decision. So, with that in mind, I decided to submit a Freedom of Information request through the university Strategic Governance Office. And I asked for any communications within the university related to my adjunct decision. And sure enough, that actually worked. And I received back two sets of email communications that showed that going back to September 2023, um, the dean in the School of Medical and Health Sciences wanted to cancel me, and wanted to cancel me right then and there for some essays that I published and some social media activity. And then when someone else at the university had said, "Oh no, academic freedom is a thing," and blah blah blah, I wasn't canceled in September 2023, but the dean stated explicitly that she was not going to renew any of my further appointments. And that brought us to March 2025 when she decided not to renew that appointment. There's more to the story. As you mentioned, I have a very long, almost like a short book um, on my academic cancellation story, and there's lots of bits and pieces in the middle there, but that's the summary of it.
Do you know what was behind it? I mean, is it because you um, touch on gender issues in your research, do you
Yes, that's
think?
exactly what it is. So what I was publishing were essays, and one was a requested interview, a written interview that I gave for the Center for Male Psychology in the UK. And the other essay so what happened was people within the school found out about these things I was publishing, which, by the way, were based off of my peer-reviewed academic research in sort of back channel email communications between a small group of them within the school. They started throwing a fit about me questioning the whole gender equity movement and talking about sex differences in certain areas. So it was because of that, those essays that I was publishing, but again, based off of my peer-reviewed research, and they didn't like what I was saying because it was very anti sort of DEI, and yeah, they wanted me out there out very very quickly. But I was able to hang on for a little while longer. But then they were monitoring my activity on X as well. You can see that in the email communications. They mention that explicitly.
So it sounds like the university was unhappy with your research. Exactly what was it that you were publishing and studying that was so controversial?
Yeah, I think what they didn't like in the sort of essays that I was publishing, I was combining a lot of different aspects of the sort of sex and gender narrative. So I was hitting on a few different areas. And how these were framed was kind of the impact of gender ideology on exercise science. That's kind of what these two essays were about at that time. And what I was just pointing out are some of the issues and contradictions that existed in some of the narratives that were being told to us in that area. So I'll give you one example. In a very popular exercise science journal, there was a paper published that said that exercise science students need to take coursework talking about domestic violence, or what they call gender-based violence. Now, if you know anything about the term gender-based violence, although it could be applied neutrally, it's not. Well, all it means is male perpetrator, female victim. And they were making this claim of students, exercise science students, need to be taught about this about this in their coursework. And I'm actually quite familiar with the domestic violence research because of getting into men's health. And I said, wait, this is not such a asymmetrical story. If you look at the data on this over decades, the rate of victimization in intimate partner violence scenarios, it's pretty close between the percentage of victims are males and females. Um, and that's been known for decades. And there's many references for that. And that's something that I would have pointed out in my essay, for example. And there were other ways that I was sort of coming at the sort of gender equity narrative and all the affiliate arguments that go along with it. And they just had this big emotional response to me questioning that. You can see it
Mm.
in the email communications. It was just a huge emotional response. How could this guy ever question anything related to the gender equity stuff? And yeah, that's why they wanted to cancel me. But there's other examples in the essays I've written. That's one off the top of my head.
Well, I want to get into those essays, but maybe we'll just start with just some of the boring data that's out there that you produce in your graph of the day series on your Nuzzo newsletter Substack. And one thing that surprised me is that despite all this concern, and I'm very much in favor of opportunities for women, that in fact at universities, women became the majority of students, not recently, not in the 2010s, not in the 2000s, but in 1988 or something like that in Australia. And in fact, it was the early 1980s in the United States. That to me was just completely at odds with the state of the public conversation. So there was this huge gap between the boring data in your chart of the day and the public conversation about opportunities for women, get women ahead in the workforce. Hey, they've been the majority of university students and staff for decades. Can you maybe talk me through that? And what else do you think that you've produced on some of those generic data points that just are at odds with the public conversation?
And this is actually another topic that was part of the cancellation.
Oh,
I had published a month before the cancellation, so in February of this year, I published a critique of Curtin University here in Perth, where they had specifically advertised positions where they wanted the person that they were hiring to increase female student representation at the university, specifically in STEM fields. So they were purposely hiring a person to increase the number of female students. Well, at both Curtin University and at ECU, the female enrollment is about 57 to 60% female. So all you're going to do is just make that number go higher and higher. So I was just pointing out how this is kind of a thing that no one's really talking about, and I criticize them and critique them. And honestly, from what I've heard, I think it's possible that someone at Curtin University actually contacted someone at ECU about my essay, and they both did not like that I was writing that. So that's another the point you're making about just this basic data that just show what the reality is. When you go to talk about it, you can see people don't even want you to talk to point out that particular bias.
no. And what about in health? You're in health and healthcare and science. One of the interesting things, is there's this push to, do research on women's health, don't neglect the women. But is it true that most health research is on men's health and that women need to sort of fight to be represented, or is it the opposite? Is it another one of those situations like at the university?
It's exactly the same situation. Yeah. So there are two kind of related claims that get made here in the media and in certain domains of academia. One is that women's health um and in women's health research is underfunded. And the other related claim is that women are understudied or underrepresented in clinical research trials. Neither of those claims is true, and they haven't been true for decades now. And that's the data you're talking about that I've published
Mm.
at the Nuzzo letter. And it's actually government data that I'm publishing. So it's coming straight from the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And in Australia, the data that I present about the funding difference comes from the NHMRC, so the National Health and Medical Research Council, who is the main funder of health research in Australia. About 80, so most, both in the US and Australia, most health research funding is not sex specific. But for that proportion that is sex specific, women's health clearly gets more money every single year and has been that way for a long time. So in Australia, NHMRC, about 80 to $100 million per year for women's health. And that does not include maternity health, which is about 50 million per year. Men's health, about 10 to 15 million per year. So that's quite different than the narrative that you hear, right, in the Sydney Morning Herald and the
Yeah.
Guardian and so on.
And is that true not just on the research path of healthcare, but also on the like hospital usage? Are women you like if we add up all the health resources of the country, all the GPs, the specialists, etc., is it mostly men using that or mostly women? Do we have any good aggregate data on that? I have my suspicions and I'll suggest why, but I thought you might
Yeah.
be the person to ask whether we
Well,
know.
in terms of the actual usage, I don't actually have those numbers in front of me. I'm not sure, but I would suspect that it's mostly women. And, in part, the men go to the doctor less and so on. But I know that from a kind of a federal budget standpoint, um, that every year, so what I was talking about earlier was kind of the research funding, but when
Mm.
you're talking about just broader, like everything, I mean, every single year, when the federal budget comes out, there is significantly more money in there for women's health just across the board within the medical system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I see two big reasons for that. One, childbirth is, a highly risky period of life for the child and the mother. And so, I mean, we'd probably expect on average much more health resources to that period of life. But also, women live longer. And so they have more years to visit the doctor, especially when they're elderly. And that's sort of another interesting background statistic, right? That women already live longer, and yet we need to devote more health spending to get them to live what, even longer than men? Is 3 years longer not enough? Is 5 years longer better? Is 10 years the ideal? What do you make of this sort of a, this sort of I guess cultural vibe that's so detached from the facts on the ground?
Well, I think we might actually have, as humans, a particular maybe biological cognitive bias toward wanting to help and protect women. So we might be sort of, in some ways, kind of working against our own, I don't know, drives.
Mm,
But it does get out of hand, especially with journalists amplifying this kind of biased sort of message. And what's happened now is because the sex difference in life expectancy essentially occurs in every single country, although it's different sizes in different countries. And that would be an obvious starting point for, okay, maybe we need to start talking about men's health a little bit more. What happens is sort of the women's health advocates, they switched the story to not be about life expectancy. So they now talk about disability years, and they kind of compile that in with years of life lost,
mm,
which kind of reflects more just the pure life expectancy measure. And you're right, because women live longer, they end up living more years of life with disability, like arthritis, for example. But the
mm,
problem there is, there might be a man who's 28 years old and kills himself, and he actually never lives long enough to even develop arthritis to begin with. So
yeah.
are those two things really all that kind of equivalent? And this is where it starts to get, yeah, a bit controversial, where you get the politics involved. And but that's how they kind of are shifting the narrative. It's kind of like, well, women have more chronic health issues and all that. It's like, yeah, okay, that's definitely a serious thing to consider. But have you also considered the men that are dying really, really early? And we
Mm.
don't tend to talk about that so much.
Yeah. One interesting data point, and you can expand if you've got some, is one thing I've noticed. My kids have trained basketball at the Sporting Wheelies here in Brisbane. It's where the wheelchair athletes go. And it's pretty much mostly men, right? Like, and then I thought, is that because men are risk takers, they ride motorbikes more, etc.? And yeah, it turns out of every five paraplegics, four are men, right? So in terms of those life years, and similar things with suicides, right? There's a bit of a reframing of that story. Um, do you know much about the suicide story and the disconnect between the media and the worry about teenage girls and the data, pure sort of numbers on that?
Well, the one way that see suicide's an interesting one because it doesn't really get talked about in a sex specific way, although there is reason to talk about it in a sex specific way because about 3 out of every 4 suicides are male. But we don't do that for suicide the same way when there is a particular health condition that impacts women more than men. It's almost always talked about as sort of a women's health issue. But when we have a particular health condition that impacts men more than women, we don't frame it as a kind of a sex specific issue. We just make it more general. So that's one thing that I see with the suicide kind of narrative in the media. It's very rarely framed as being a predominantly male issue. Now, it is also true that women attempt suicide at equal or greater rates, but men are much more likely to complete the suicide act.
Yeah, well, um, men are known to be doers. They're very good at focusing on one task and getting the task done. So I guess there's some side effects to that as well. Um, so I guess I also want to broaden the conversation from health, and you had some really interesting data on your website about hired killings, that there's a big gender bias in people hiring other people to kill their spouse or someone. How did you find that data, and what was what was the surprise there?
So one of the interesting things of me kind of transitioning a little bit from exercise science to more men's health and sex differences is I get lots of emails and people telling, "Hey, have you ever looked into this thing? Have you looked into this topic?" And people have a lot of interesting ideas. And one thing that was mentioned to me is, "Hey, we don't really have clear data on this concept of hired killing, so hiring a hitman." And it was put forward to me in the context of like intimate partner relationships and divorcing and someone hiring someone to take out their spouse after a divorce or whatever, the stuff you kind of see in the movies, right? So I said, okay, this is kind of interesting. It seems like it's going to be hard to find these data, but I'll give it a go. So the only data I was able to find, it's quite dated, but it's the best that we have to work on. The Australia Institute of Criminology has a very good report, again, albeit I think from the early 2000s, where they collected years of data on hired killings in Australia. And then in the US, I found a master's thesis from about I think 1990s,
Hmm.
which was a small sample from the state of Tennessee and in a prison where hired killers were in prison there. So what these data in both countries show, there's sort of like you can think of it as like 3 people involved in this process. So there's the person that gets killed, there is the person that does the killing, and then there's the person that hires the killer, hired killings, right? Um, Almost 100% of the time, the person that gets hired to do the killing is a male. I think over 95% of hired killers are male. When it comes to the victims of the killing, it's about 70% male, 30% female. But again, we're working off of kind of limited numbers here. So,
Hmm.
and when it comes to the solicitor, so the person doing the hiring, you're looking at about 20 to 40% female doing the hiring, and then, 60 to 80% males. And the Australian Criminology Institute of Criminology report is a good document to read because they actually break it down in terms of what are the circumstances going on here that people are doing this, and a lot of it has to deal with breakdowns in relationships, someone um, maybe hiring someone to kill their current partner so that they can be with someone else,
Mm.
or someone having their ex killed so they can have sole custody of the kids. So that report goes through a few of the different scenarios. I mean, it's not the most comfortable thing to, but we should be aware of it.
I want to zoom out and talk about the social changes around gender that have happened in the last decade. But In the last year of you writing your newsletter, is there any other quirky data that you just thought was super interesting when you found it that showed a very unexpected pattern of gender like that? I mean, I don't think the Hyde killings is too unexpected that, 95% of the killers were men. Is there anything else that you thought was super interesting that you'd never expected to find?
That's actually a really good question. That information on hired killings is one of the more kind of different ones that I've put out there, kind of a very niche topic.
Hmm.
One that for me, it sort of comes down to data that I've always wanted to know, but I felt people haven't put out there. So they're not necessarily surprising results, but now I've confirmed it. So one example is just um, the sex of the employees at like different health agencies, like within the government or at United Nations women, entity and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
one reason why I'm really interested in that type of data is because it relates back to the narratives we were talking about health funding, and we don't care about women's health and all that. But the vast majority of the employees that work in the government health offices, it's like 70% women. So what are they doing? Are they But the reality is they are looking out for their own sex, and that's why they get more money every year. But you see how it contradicts with sort of all the narratives going on. So I find that data quite fascinating as well.
And so is that also true in universities? The majority of academic staff women now as well?
Yes, yeah, especially
Oh,
when you
no.
yeah, especially when you add in administrative staff with the actual the faculty.
Hmm.
Because administrative staff is highly female.
Yeah.
And then, but even in terms of professors now, particularly at sort of the lower levels of professorship, yeah. So it's the academic world is becoming very highly female oriented.
So to loop back around to your cancellation story, you're in an academic environment with uh, predominantly women administrators, potentially mostly women faculty, and that's often the case in some disciplines like psychology. I believe is over 80% women. There's some disciplines that just literally mostly women. It's quite interesting. There's not much of a movement to equalize, men's opportunity in psychology or things like that. I've not heard of that, but maybe there is. Do you think then your cancellation is an isolated sort of issue, or do you know of other sort of cancellation attempts or shutdowns of the freedom of speech in universities because of these gender sensitivities or any other sensitivity? Do you have any other stories you could share, or do you know if it's more common or whether you're the isolated incident?
Definitely not an isolated incident. People that are interested in the topic should go visit the College Fix website. So the
Mm-hmm.
College Fix is a news website that focuses on stories within academia. And the College Fix maintains what they call a cancel culture database. So they database examples of academic cancellations, and they even have it so that you can filter by the type of cancellation. And it's really interesting to go through and have a read of that. So it's definitely a thing that has happened. And I will say it seems to correlate with the increased representation of women at universities. I say that because you may have seen recently, there's been some viral articles going around about, so I think Helen Andrews was the author of one recent article called The Feminization of something or other.
Yep.
And
I've,
this all relates. And how it all relates is, and I talk about this in my cancellation story. If you survey men and women, academic men and women, about what their priorities are as academics, or even students about their academic priorities, and you allow them to kind of weight what they feel is kind of most important in terms of pursuit of knowledge, the scientific method, social justice, student emotional well-being. Um, women are much more interested in things like social justice and emotional well-being of students. And for men, it's more, pursuit of knowledge, and men are less likely to advocate for cancellations. That's what some of these initial survey studies are showing. So it's not a surprise to me that as the universities and really any other institution becomes more female, you have a greater tendency to see these sorts of things. And there's now various hypotheses being thrown around about why is this the case? Why do kind of groups of women operate differently than groups of men and all that?
Yeah, look, that's very interesting. I guess I'll share with you and listeners. The academic world is, you're not an isolated incident. I've been assured by academics that I shouldn't bother applying for certain jobs because I'm the wrong race and gender. And of course, my response to them is, how do you know I don't identify as an Aboriginal woman? How presumptuous. But
Yeah.
it's true that there is a culture of, oh, there's too many guys in this room, better get some extra women. I'm not sure that the reverse applies just yet. I don't know if in some female majority departments they sit there and go, wouldn't it be great if there were a few more men in here? So it's an odd situation. So zooming out to that culture you talked about and that article, I guess one of the questions, as an economist, is like, is it bad? Like, is there any sort of cost to ensuring, there's lots of opportunities for women, even once they're the majority? Is this just a minor inconvenience for some people, but it's really helping spread lots of opportunities? Or is there a real genuine cost? And what would that be?
I guess there's kind of two ways to respond to that. One is kind of the university specific thing that's happening. And then
Mm-hmm.
then there's kind of a question of more broadly about talking about sex differences and acknowledging them. So
Mm-hmm.
with the university question, I would say that what's happening now is the purpose of the university seems to be changing as the ratio of females to males on campus changes, where it's becoming more of sort of a mechanism for political activism, more so than the sort of just the pursuit of knowledge and sticking to the scientific method. I think that as if we continue down that pathway, what is ultimately going to happen is employers are going to be less concerned about what your academic credential is. They're going to be less concerned whether you have a bachelor's degree from this place. And employers will just find other ways to assess someone's credentials. I mean, that is the main power that universities hold. They're our sort of main job credentialing agency, right? And
Mm.
once they lose that power, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so I think if they keep going down this more kind of, we're here to be social justice warriors, I think the quality of the students will continue to go down. Employers are going to say, look, this serves no purpose for us anymore. We're just going to ignore whether they have a bachelor's degree from your uni. And I think, yeah, we'll see the universities decline if they don't adjust. On the broader topic of being able to talk about sex differences openly, and rather than just being canceled for talking about them, I think that's a really big thing because um, we have a lot of issues right now. So tying it back to the economy, when you have relationship breakdown, divorce, when you have boys who grow up in kind of fatherless homes and get into delinquency issues and all that, that's huge economic costs. You know, if you think about, I don't know, boys that grow up in a fatherless home because the man and the woman couldn't quite understand each other very well because they don't understand sex differences. That boy goes on to get into trouble. He then ends up in prison. Well, who pays for the prison costs? The taxpayers pay for that. Then we lose his productivity as a worker from the economy. And the list goes on and on. So I think, yeah, if we're not able to talk about sex differences openly, I think it just will, yeah, lead to a lot of issues.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. There's this odd thing that rather than appreciate the things women do well on average better than men, we've instead sort of said, no, no, they're the same as men. And we can't talk about those differences. And I do find that an odd situation, and it leads to all these perverse things. There's no push for 50% women in bricklaying and plumbing and truck driving and mechanics, right? These are still 95 plus percent men industries, and there's absolutely no interest in making them 50-50 because they're not high status things, right? And we all sort of we know deep down that women can't move as many bricks in one day. It would be rare, a rare woman who could keep up with the average man on a heavy job like that. So we know it. We know it deep in our hearts, but we want to play this game of pretending no, but in other areas we're identical, rather than acknowledging women are really good at certain things, men are really good at other things. We've got to, as a society and economy, make sure that we're matching up and doing things we're good at and appreciating everyone's input. So that's sort of my take, and it really frustrates me. I'll give you an interesting example. I was, in economics, there's a big question about women getting paid less than men, right? And when you start breaking it down, it's very hard to see. There are studies, for example, on Uber driving, where you can know exactly same job, same task. Well, men drive faster, they work longer, and they make more money on average. So it's not the same job, is it? Right? It's a different
Yeah.
task, and they make a different amount of money. But what's really interesting is I wrote an article and said, well, isn't it funny that we're so obsessed with the income side of the ledger, but not the spending side? Because people live in households and they get incomes and they pool them together and then they spend them on the individuals. And the research shows that if you look at households, women do a lot of the spending. And in fact, men basically just give women in their household money their whole lives during their working lives, when they've got children, and during retirement. And so I said, look, which is more unfair, right? The fact that women earn less or the fact that they spend more than what they earn, right? You can't just have it both ways. There's two sides to every story. In the economy, there's two sides to every trade. People got very upset. They're like, oh, but what about domestic violence? I'm like, why are you talking? This is not the subject of this thing. Oh yeah, but what about if this happened? I'm like, yeah, what about everything?
Yeah.
Can you not acknowledge that this is the norm? Just look, just go and door knock in your street and ask everyone who earns more and who makes the spending decisions. And you will validate this. It's obvious to everyone, but some kind of like social taboo about talking
Yeah.
about it. And it's really a strange one. So with that in mind, I guess I'd like your views, James, on whether you are noticing or predicting a pendulum shift on this in the coming years. We're in a very politically disruptive period, let's call it. The nationalistic parties. Trump has said you can say retard now, and sort of a lot of these social taboos are breaking down.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any shift back? Do you think maybe the US is a little ahead of a curve if there is a pendulum shift and Australia's still on the upswing? Or do you think there's nothing yet that you can see?
I agree with your observation there. So I think the election of Trump is sort of the start of a correction. Um, he's sort of like a blunt instrument, right? Coming in, uh, that administration is trying to get things corrected at the universities, which will have a big impact. As you know, I've chatted about already, the universities are a big issue in all of this. So I see that as a correction. I do see that Australia is behind in that regard, but hopefully they will follow suit. I'm involved in various kind of men's organizations. I think most of us in those groups feel like there's a momentum shift with talking about men's health, which means also talking about sex differences. We're not quite there yet, but I think the epidemiological data that I publish and others publish, it's too obvious. You just can't deny it. I mean, the life expectancy difference, it's just right there staring you at the face. So I think we are going to see more about men's health. Now, it'll be a question as to how a lot of that stuff is framed, but I think we're getting there. I think there's more people coming around to being critical of the sort of COVID response, uh, being critical of the gender sports stuff. You can kind of see that in some of the survey data where actually some women are now becoming a little bit more comfortable saying, "Oh yeah, actually," because it is oddly enough, it is men that are more protective of women's sports than women are when you survey them about this issue. But there's a YouGov poll that's been tracking this for a few years, and men have remained mostly the same on this issue, but women are sort of catching up. So you can see some
Mm.
shifts. You can see some shifts there. Um, at the university where I was, the vice chancellor of education, who is a big DEI critical theory person, which would affect the entire education system at ECU, she has said that she's going to step down next year. The reasons for that are not entirely clear, but I know that she has been very heavily criticized for this critical theory approach to education. And I also know that in about a month's time, toward the end of November, the Australian Science and Freedom are holding a conference in Sydney. I'm a part of that group. One of the main themes we're going to talk about, including my presentation, is about academic cancel culture. How can we reform education? And this is a group that came out of that whole COVID era response. So there are signs that things are beginning to change.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on after a good deep dive in the data. Sad here story of your cancellation and the cultural sort of changes. I do recommend to listeners try and get to the Australians for Science and Freedom conference. I'm good friends with Gigi Foster. I had a ticket to go, but I couldn't make it down to Sydney this year. So unfortunately, I'll have to see you there next year in person, James. Where can people find you if they want to read your articles and see your amazing graphs and understand the data better?
So the main place is my Substack page, which is called the Nuzzo letter. And then second to that would just be my X account, which is just my name. So James L. Nuzzo. And those are the two sites where I'm most active.
Thanks for coming, James. Listeners, please go and check out James's work. And until next time, catch you later.
Thanks.